to turn it to our first speaker. Next slide, please. So our first speaker today is Hanno Ronte, a partner at Deloitte leading the life sciences and healthcare team. He's responsible for building the real-world evidence capability. His projects have focused on corporate and business unit strategy, competitive response, marketing strategy, and capability building. And today he'll be highlighting trust in the COVID-19 supply chain. And now I'm so pleased to welcome and turn it over to Hanno.
Well, thank you very much, Kathy. What a pleasure to be here. And thank you for that excellent introduction and around the importance of standards in building trust. And that's what we want to explore a little bit today, using COVID the COVID vaccines as a topic for exploration. But firstly, around just how does trust actually come about? Trust comes about, in our view, by being capable, by being reliable, and having that sort of competence delivered with right intent. And that intent has to demonstrate a degree of humanity and ultimately transparency. And in particular around transparency, that's where standards are really important, is because they create an even playing field, a clarity of communication between everybody concerned. And we have seen this sort of trust as an element being really exemplified by the COVID vaccines. Firstly, the capability simply to develop it at real speed, requiring a high degree of collaboration between industry, governments, and regulators. And we have seen the reliability of actually scaling production to such enormous levels so that today 60% of the world's population has received at least one dose. And mind you, that is still 39% or 40% who have not received it yet. So there's still a long way to go. But still, it is an unprecedented achievement. And we have done that in part by being much more visible in terms of demonstrating intent. Never before have leaders of pharmaceutical organizations who are building vaccines become such a public face of vaccines. But it is that transparency that has ultimately helped ensure some of the successes that we have seen. And why does that matter? Well, if you act with this sort of competence and intent that we've just talked about, then it requires a degree of leadership by all different organizations, whether that is governments, and more than ever have we seen prime ministers, presidents standing on public platforms, not just declaring the intent around vaccinations, but exemplifying the associated behaviors with it. But it is then about, it raises the bar. You have to deliver with excellence. And again, as we'll talk about in a minute more, I think the standard, in particular the G10 standards, the barcodes, have been instrumental in creating visibility across the global supply chain. And that ultimately, all these things end up earning trust, which then not just for vaccines, but in a broader sense, create a better engagement by all parties concerned, right from delivery partners in the supply chain for COVID, all the way down to employees, all the way down to hopefully the citizens who take the vaccines. And we'll come on to that as well, because that's where I think we still see some trust deficits. What have we learned? So we wrote a paper a year ago thinking through what does the role of the GS1 standard have to play in the COVID supply chain. And we have learned a lot, and we will update this paper in the next month or so. But what have we learned? Well, firstly, it goes without saying that clear collaboration in vaccine development has been an instrumental factor to really build the trust that there is a vaccine. Ironically, though, there's also a negative to that. We've seen so many vaccines now arrive that there is a sort of this sense of citizens and people around what is the best vaccine? Can we find the one vaccine that is really the ultimate one for us to take? And so it's interesting that availability of lots of vaccines has been a great exemplar of what we can do, but it has also created new questions that we need to work through. And it also, from a trust perspective going forward, I think raises important questions about how will governments and the industry continue to work together to identify new variants, to develop new solutions to flu, to a SARS-based vaccine that could help us avoid another pandemic, and in particular, a deadly variant of this disease. And I think that requires new collaboration models, it requires new protocols, and potentially even new legal frameworks. The second one, and ultimately a key ingredient of success, has been really around global standards and serializations, as Kathy outlined at the beginning. And the reason why that is important is because for the first time, really, you can now see on your app, when you have to demonstrate your vaccination status in most Western countries, even what the batch number is of your product. That is quite an unprecedented feat of linking different pieces of data. But of course, we know that that is easier to do in well-funded countries. But I think we've seen in particular challenges in developing and emerging markets, where often the standardization agenda is high and the G10 barcode is used, but often data exchange falls apart at very simple things such as wrong versions of Excel not matching, and therefore the data exchange being poor. But it has, though, on the great benefit, actually also enabled us to fundamentally track and trace much better where batches of vaccine are. It is also, though, from a standards perspective, meant that unfortunately we were able to or had to destroy a lot of unused vaccines because they seem to have expired too early. So this question around how do we build the right standards and a good understanding of what expiry dates are for vaccines, I think will be a really important feature of tracking as part of the serialization. And we see the attempts in different countries of increasing serialization, in particular in developing markets, going at pace, whether that is in countries such as Ethiopia. The third topic that we have seen emerging in building trust is fundamentally around the last mile of delivery. We have been able to ship vaccines over great distances from central manufacturing hubs, but often it has been the last mile that has been the more difficult one. We see, even in the US and in developed countries, differences between vaccination rates of between 15 and 20% between the rural and more urban areas. And we have seen significant efforts by countries such as Kenya using air doctors to bring vaccines to remote locations, which are compensating for that last mile. And we have also seen, and that is from a manufacturing and also from a standards perspective, an interesting topic, the ability and the announcement from companies like BioNTech this week around modularizing manufacturing to be able to bring the manufacturing closer to the markets and the citizens, to remove the cold chain element or the need for long-term, long supply chain, cold chain elements, and make that a much more effective and better distribution mechanism. But even there, you know, what is interesting is standards for packaging have been used with the G10 code, but I think there's also a question about how will inspections of manufacturing, etc., capture all those different modalities now. But last mile, a key theme going forward. And then the last topic is one around trust, really, in communication, is how we communicate and build trust. And this is where I think we have seen the biggest challenges in some ways, where there are lots of parts of the population which are still not vaccinated. And we see governments in particular being quite forceful, even mandating vaccination rates. And even in developed countries like Germany, I'm always astounded almost what the level of mistrust is in society, where you have to not only get vaccinated, but you have to typically, even when you order something in a shop or in a stall in a Christmas market, that you have to say that you've been vaccinated. First. Second, you have to demonstrate that you have a vaccination certificate. And thirdly, you have to demonstrate that it is actually who you are. So there is a lot of work to be done in terms of thinking through how to improve the trust in taking vaccines. And that is particularly true for what we've seen, in particular for more ethnic minorities, where there is a much greater level of mistrust around what the vaccines are. And as the pandemic is becoming part of life, of living with the pandemic, that I think is a key role also for standards to ensure that the vaccines are what they are, that they are not fake, something we'll explore later on in this session, and that citizens can rely on the protection that they give to each other individually as well as society as a whole. And we'll explore some of those themes in our paper that we will publish next March. But let me hand over back to Kathy to introduce the next speaker. Thank you.